Imagine waking up one morning in Caracas and hearing that US warplanes flying from a carrier group off your coast might soon be authorized to strike targets inside your country. Officially, the mission would be about counter-narcotics and security. But everyone knows who the message is really meant for: the government in Miraflores Palace. Let's roll the tape back 25 years, back to when Washington praised Venezuela as a stable democracy and dependable oil partner. Back to a time when the idea of closed airspace, oil embargoes, and terrorism indictments between the two countries would have sounded absurd. So how do you get from friendly oil supplier to strategic enemy in just one generation? How did a relationship built on mutual profit turn into a confrontation involving sanctions, mass migration, and warships sitting off the Venezuelan coast? That is the story of US-Venezuela relations over the last quarter century. And the key is not just what happened, but the chain of cause and effect that turned each crisis into the seed of the next one. Long before Hugo Chávez, Venezuela was often described as an outlier in Latin America. It was relatively wealthy, with huge oil reserves and a reputation for electoral democracy. US oil companies invested heavily, and Venezuelan crude flowed reliably to American refineries. But beneath the surface, a different reality was forming. The country's oil wealth was enormous, but deeply unequal. A small elite benefited from high oil prices, while large parts of the population lived in poverty. Corruption was endemic. A rigid party system rotated power among the same political families. When oil prices fell in the 1980s, economic crisis hit hard. Austerity measures triggered riots and brutal crackdowns. Trust in traditional politics collapsed. Into this vacuum stepped a former paratrooper who had once led a failed coup, Hugo Chávez. Chávez ran for president in 1998 as an outsider, promising to wipe out corruption, rewrite the constitution, and use oil money for the poor. His rhetoric attacked the old parties and also hinted at a broader critique of US influence in Latin America. When he took office in 1999, Washington watched with suspicion, but not open hostility. Oil kept flowing. Meetings were held. For a moment, it seemed Chávez and the US might manage a tense but workable relationship. Then he began restructuring the system. Chávez called a constituent assembly, rewrote the constitution, and concentrated more power in the presidency. He moved to bring the state oil company, PDVSA, firmly under political control. Contracts were rewritten, royalties were raised, and the state demanded a bigger share of revenues. He framed it as taking back national sovereignty from foreign corporations and domestic oligarchs. This is where the first big turn happens. Changing who controls oil revenue does not just move numbers on a balance sheet, it shifts power, and those who lose out rarely accept that quietly. By 2002, a coalition of opposition parties, business leaders, and parts of the military united against Chávez. In April of that year, a coup briefly removed him from power. He was taken into custody, an interim government was announced, and for 2 days it looked like the revolution was over. Then something unexpected happened. Loyal sections of the military refused to accept the new rulers. Crowds of Chávez supporters poured into the streets. Under pressure, the coup collapsed, and Chávez returned to the presidency. The United States had quickly signaled support for the interim government before it fell apart. Even though US officials later stepped back and denied direct involvement, the damage was done. In the eyes of Chávez and his supporters, Washington had shown its hand. A few months later, a massive strike and lockout at PDVSA tried to remove Chávez by paralyzing the oil industry. Tankers sat idle, facilities shut down, and the economy plunged. Chávez responded by firing thousands of striking employees and rebuilding PDVSA with loyalists. For Chávez, the lesson was blunt. Domestic elites, backed by the US, would use economic weapons to defeat his project. For Washington, a once professional oil company had been purged and politicized, and Venezuela now looked like a risky partner led by a radical populist. From that point on, trust never recovered. Chávez doubled down on a new identity. He forged close alliances with Cuba, cultivated ties with Russia and Iran, and built regional initiatives like Petrocaribe, sending discounted oil to Caribbean and Central American countries in return for political support. At home, he used oil revenue to fund social programs that reduced measured poverty and improved access to education and healthcare, especially during the years of high global oil prices. But the model had weaknesses. The state grew more dependent on oil income and arbitrary controls. Corruption, inefficiency, and lack of investment slowly undermined production. The system required both high oil prices and tight political discipline to keep going. When either faltered, cracks appeared. By the late 2000s, confrontation with the US moved from harsh rhetoric to targeted sanctions and diplomatic clashes. Ambassadors were expelled and reinstalled. The US criticized Venezuela's democratic backsliding and alleged support for drug traffickers. Chávez accused the US of plotting coups across the region and seeking control over Venezuela's oil. Then came the succession. Hugo Chávez died in 2013. His chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver and foreign minister, took over a country already sliding into crisis. Oil prices were falling. PDVSA was weakened. The government responded to shortages and fiscal problems with more controls rather than structural reform. Inflation began to climb, then spiral. Price controls, currency distortions, and shrinking production fed off each other. Protests erupted. Security forces and pro-government groups cracked down, leaving dead and injured in the streets. In 2015, the United States formally labeled the situation in Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to US national security and opened the door to a broader sanctions framework. The first measures were limited, aimed mainly at individuals accused of corruption or human rights abuses, but the situation kept deteriorating. In 2017, Maduro used a loyal Supreme Court and a new Constituent Assembly to sideline the opposition-controlled National Assembly. Protests surged again. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans began leaving the country as food and medicine shortages worsened. That same year, the US escalated. Restrictions were placed on Venezuela's access to US financial markets, cutting off easy refinancing. 2 years later, after a contested election in 2018 and Washington's recognition of opposition leader Juan Guaidó as interim president, the US imposed sanctions on the heart of the Venezuelan economy, PDVSA, and the oil sector. The theory in Washington was that starving the government of oil dollars would fracture the regime and force a transition. The reality was different. Oil production, already falling, collapsed more sharply. Revenue dried up. The government turned even more to allies like Russia and Iran, illicit gold mining and opaque deals to stay afloat. Hyperinflation exploded, wiping out salaries and savings. Ordinary Venezuelans bore the brunt of both internal mismanagement and external pressure. Maduro, however, held on. Opposition hopes that sanctions would quickly topple. The government proved overly optimistic. Instead of breaking, the ruling coalition adapted, concentrating power further and relying more on security forces and patronage networks. The humanitarian situation worsened dramatically. Hospitals lacked basic supplies. Millions of Venezuelans left the country, seeking work and safety in Colombia, Peru, Chile, Brazil, and eventually heading north toward the United States. Under pressure from both the human rights crisis and migration politics, the US experimented with a different approach: conditional relief. Some sanctions were relaxed under special licenses that allowed limited oil exports and operations, particularly with US and European companies. In exchange, Washington demanded electoral reforms, negotiations with the opposition, and the release of political prisoners. But each partial step forward was followed by new disputes, accusations of broken promises, contested election timelines, and renewed crackdowns. Licenses became bargaining chips, issued and withdrawn in response to political signals. The relationship turned into a cycle of threats, limited openings, and retightened restrictions. Then the confrontation took on a more overtly military tone. As US indictments labeled top Venezuelan officials as narco-terrorists, Washington announced new counter-narcotics operations in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Over time, more warships and aircraft were deployed to the region. including powerful surface ships and eventually a large carrier strike group. Officially, these missions were aimed at drug trafficking and transnational crime. But their positioning off Venezuelan waters, combined with heated rhetoric about the Maduro government, sent a different signal. Pressure was no longer just economic and diplomatic. It was also military. Venezuelan authorities responded with their own language of defiance, closing airspace, announcing military exercises, calling up militias, and portraying the deployment as proof of a foreign plot to invade, seize resources, and overturn the government. So in about 25 years, the US-Venezuela relationship moved from uneasy partnership to full-spectrum confrontation. Sanctions, indictments, migration crises, and a large US naval presence near Venezuelan shores. Step back, and you can see a pattern that goes beyond these two countries. First, you have a deeply unequal but stable economic partnership built around a strategic resource. Second, a political upheaval promises to redistribute that wealth and challenge foreign influence. Third, domestic elites and foreign powers react, using coups, strikes, and economic pressure. Fourth, new leaders respond by centralizing power and seeking alternative allies, even if they are rivals to the original partner. Fifth, sanctions expand, humanitarian conditions deteriorate, and political positions harden. Finally, security logic takes over, and military deployments or security operations rise in prominence. We have seen similar patterns in other regions, though with different details and outcomes. The US-Venezuela case is a particularly sharp example because the collapse was so deep. An oil giant plunged into hyperinflation, with millions of citizens leaving, and a government that survives largely through repression, external deals, and crisis management. So what should we take away from this story? First, economic pressure is a blunt tool. Sanctions can weaken a government financially, but they do not guarantee political change. In Venezuela, sanctions helped push an already fragile economy into freefall, but the ruling elite adapted and stayed in power, while ordinary citizens bore most of the suffering. Second, once narratives harden, they become self-reinforcing. In Caracas, every US move is interpreted as proof of a long-term plan to seize Venezuela's oil and crush its sovereignty. In Washington, every negotiation or concession is seen by some as appeasing a criminal authoritarian regime. These mirror image stories make compromise look like betrayal on both sides. Third, when great powers and resource-rich states collide, it is usually the population caught in the middle that pays the highest cost. In this case, it is Venezuelan families facing shortages, migration, and insecurity, and communities across the hemisphere grappling with the consequences of mass displacement and organized crime. The warning here is not limited to Venezuela. As the world becomes more dependent on critical minerals, energy routes, and data infrastructure, the temptation to use economic and military tools to enforce political outcomes will grow. Other countries with strategic resources and fragile institutions could find themselves on a similar path, from partnership to conflict, to sanctions, to the sight of foreign warships just over the horizon. The question is whether we learn from this 25-year experiment in confrontation, or whether we repeat it in new forms elsewhere. If you want more deep dives into how today's geopolitical flashpoints were built, step by step over decades, consider subscribing. Because behind every closed airspace and every carrier group on the horizon, there is a long chain of decisions, fears, and missed chances. Understanding that chain is the first step to breaking it.